We are in chapter 4. Let's remember that at the end of chapter 3, Finney, spontaneous, impulsive Finney, has decided that he and Jean, should bike to the New Hampshire shore and go to the beach. It's a 3-hour bike ride. They don't have very much money, and they get there, and they spend the night on the sand. And in chapter 4, it's Jean who wakes up first and takes a look at the sunrise. And if you look at the first paragraph, he mentions death 4 times, 3 or 4 times. This looks dead, this looks deathly. Why is Jean talking about death? Well, Finney's asleep, so death is now in the novel. And Finney wakes up second and says, well, that was one of the better sleeps I've had. And Jean says to him, well, when have you ever had a bad sleep? Well, that must mean that Finney sleeps pretty soundly. We're not so sure if Jean does. He was the one who woke up first, after all. Now, Jean has an inner clock, and his inner clock is ringing its alarm because he knows that if they bike now and leave the beach now on their bikes without any breakfast, they can get back to Devon in 3 hours, and he can make it in time for his trigonometry test, which is very important to him. But instead of leaving right away, Finney says that he's going to go for a swim. Jean does not swim. Finney goes for a swim, comes out of the water. He's invigorated, talkative, glowing with energy. And then they get on their bikes for their 75 cents and they bike back to Devon without any breakfast. And Jean reaches the test room in time and fails the trigonometry test. First time he's ever failed a trig test. And it's almost devastating for him. That night, when they're in their room, they're talking, and Finney says to Jean, Jean, I waste your time for you. And Jean doesn't know how to relate to that. Remember, Jean's got an emotional conflict. We're going to have to talk about that in a little bit. They get into a discussion about whether or not Jean should be the valedictorian, the guy with the highest GPA. And they go back and forth, and Jean asks Finney, would you mind my being valedictorian? And Finney gives him a half smile and says, I would kill myself out of envy. We right now know that envy is one of Jean's emotions, and envy is now in the novel. Jean wants to be the head of the class so he can be even with Finney. He says, if you took all of my academic abilities and all his athletic abilities and you weighed them out, we'd come out being even. I just want to be even with him. Well, is that really true? And if you want to be head of the class, you got to be competitive and you got to go after it. So Jean's got a competitive streak in him. And then Jean asks him again, would you want me to be head of the school? And Finney says he despises the possibility. And Jean doesn't quite know how to take that. Jean takes everything Finney says very much to heart, very personally. And so in a paragraph, he talks about detonation, explosion. And detonation happens to their relationship in the following things. Their friendship, their affection is exploded, their partnership, they're relying on someone and being able to trust someone in the world of a small boys' prep school. All those things are detonated for Jean right there. But who are they detonated for him or for Finney? You have to keep asking these questions. But then he has another realization. He wants to be even with Finney. There is one way in which he is even with Finney, and that is in the word enmity. As enemies, they are equal. Again, does Jean feel this enmity? Or does Finney feel it? Or do they both feel it? I think right now we're starting to figure out the answer. And then finally, Jean has another devastating realization. He comes to the realization that Finney is out to wreck his studies. And at this point, we have to put the brakes on and we have to talk about a little word. It's a powerful word, but Jean has not learned how to say it. And it's the word no. The word no. No is a powerful word, and some people say it's a complete sentence. Jean could have said to Finney, no, I can't make that bike ride to the beach. I have to study for the trigonometry test. He could have said, no, I can't go to the secret society meeting tonight. I have to get ready for the history test, or I've got to write this essay. He hasn't learned to say no to Finney because he's worried about his reaction. And Gene is not wired to the point where he can say no and not really care about the other person's reaction. He could say no, and if Finney said, well, I don't like that, he'd say, well, that's your problem, Finney, but I'm going to do this. He hasn't learned how to do that. Flip side is Gene assumes Finney's reaction. He thinks if he said no, that Finney would call him this or call him that or ridicule him in some way. He hasn't tested the waters. So Gene has not learned how to say no, so he is as much to blame for his situation with Finney as anybody is. You got to learn to say no in life sometimes. Gene hasn't learned that. If Finney is competitive at sports, Gene is almost cutthroat at academics, and he's got a competitor named Chet Douglas. But Chet Douglas is way different from Gene. Gene's out for grades. Chet Douglas is out for learning. And when you teach a long time, you see over the years very few learners. You see a lot of people who are after the grade. And I'm not condemning that because, after all, it's competitive. You got to get into college. You got to get a job. You got to have all these credentials. But Chet Douglas is the guy who likes to learn stuff. And there's a doctor I heard once who said, I like my kids to learn, the grades take care of themselves. He says, by the way, they all got 4.0s. Okay. But Gene is studying for grades, not for learning. It's hard for Gene to remember sometimes when he's with Finney and they're hitting it off and they're really good friends and enjoying each other's company, who hates whom? And it's a question. Who does hate who? Does Finney hate Gene, or does Gene hate Finney, or does neither one hate either one? At times when he's with Finney, he is so happy he wants to cry out in joy. He wants to cry out with promise and believe in beauty. But exams are coming down the road pretty darn fast. And he decides, again, not saying no, he chooses to go to the meeting at night of the Secret Suicide Society because he doesn't want Finney to understand him the way he understands Finney. Again, we ask the question, do you really understand Finney, Gene? But I think Finney understands Gene pretty well. Finney understands that Gene needs to loosen up a little bit, enjoy life a little bit, and Gene's not getting the message. And then Finney says to Gene, well, okay, you can study. That's all he says. Okay, you can study. Gene reads into it. He reads too much into it. He's groping for what's behind the words. He doesn't think Finney's being honest. Finney's about as honest as anybody's going to get. And then they go to the tree. And this is where the accident occurs. Because here's the wording of the last paragraph in chapter 4. Finney is out on the limb. Gene is closer into the trunk. He's waiting his turn to jump off. And Gene says, my knees bent. And I jounced the limb. Finney turns back to look at him. He's startled. Finney falls off the limb, crashes to the ground with a sickening thud, and his leg is shattered. But let's go back and look at the wording. My knees bent and I jounced the limb. It does not read, I bent my knees and jounced the limb. It could be possible that Gene was on the limb, started to lose his balance, bent his knees to get it back, so in so doing jounced the limb, Finney falls off. But that's not how Gene is going to see it.